All right, we're going to get started again. This is the third session in Identity at Scale. My name is Greg Smith. I'm your host for this track. Today we're hearing about some very interesting use cases dealing with large populations of identities and how to manage them. You've probably noticed a recurring theme of automation, avoiding downtime, adapting to cloud-hosted models, and staying cost-effective. For our final session this afternoon, we have David Skyberg. From privacy-enhanced mail systems to cloud-based identity as a service solutions, David has been developing identity products and engineering teams for over 25 years. David has worked for industry-leading companies such as RSA Security, Microsoft, and Ping Identity. David is currently Director of Engineering and Operations for Confyrm, Inc. I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Greg. Just out of curiosity, before we start, how many folks in here work for a SaaS-style business? We actually have a couple. That's excellent. The rest of you are all enterprise identity professionals, right? And the last couple of talks have really emphasized the effort required to manage identity enterprise products. It's no small feat. We're going to flip that around a bit in this talk and talk about something completely different. We're going to talk about what would it take to kick those to the curb. If you're a SaaS provider, you understand what I'm talking about. The rest of you, kind of close your eyes for a minute and dream about what would it be like to, instead of being an enterprise identity professional, be a professional working for a SaaS. Right? That's what we're going to talk about today. All right. Da-da-da. So I'll be talking about our journey at Confyrm from using on-premises enterprise products in a 100% cloud-based service to leveraging identity as a service. If you aren't familiar with identity as a service, don't worry, we'll touch on that as well. Now, just to provide a little bit of context, our product provides a hub-based pub/sub clearinghouse in which published events are broadcast to many subscribers. Basically, we're architected for high volumes of very small packets over multiple protocols. Almost all interaction with our service is from service accounts via some kind of automated application in our customer's domain, with a very small fraction of interaction from user accounts via web UI. Right? So you get that kind of picture. The vast majority of interaction with our API is from service accounts hosted on our customers' data centers. And through the rest of this presentation, as I talk about our identity requirements, this is the environment in which they need to be able to function. Right? Now, Confyrm's a startup, and like any startup, we have limited resources and need to make the best use of those. But because our target is in the identity market, we must absolutely make sure we have a rock-solid secure offering. That doesn't mean the bar is any higher for us than other SaaSes or any other organization, but it does mean we may be keenly aware of that need. All right, the principles we use to guide our architecture and design aren't specific to startups or even SaaSes, and I've heard a lot of that, the same language from the presentations today. But they work very well for delivering 100% cloud-based services in a continuous deployment model. This model allows us to deploy our services many times a day if we need to, which means we really want to focus on only deploying the bare minimum, which leads to my first axiom. Don't deploy what you don't build. Now, like all of you, we believe in building only what's core to our business. Where we might differ is in how we think about everything else and how everything else should be managed. All the stuff we use, but we don't actually build. Like you, we don't sell SQL. So, like most of you, we don't build SQL. Where we might differ a bit is that we're also not content to deploy someone else's SQL product in our environment. If we deploy it, we're responsible for making it available, managing versions, et cetera, et cetera. If you've been here for the last few talks, you know exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about the cost of managing a deployment of an enterprise product. We would much rather spend those precious DevOps cycles on deploying our own stuff better and faster. Which brings us to our prime directive: convert everything that is not core to a service, preferably somebody else's. So we may end up paying more for service subscriptions, but we spend less time on them. Now, there are actually quite a few apps that fit into this category of other stuff. Right? For us, that includes Nexus repositories, Docker registries, Postgres and MongoDB, Jenkins, Console, Zookeeper, Logstash, Elasticsearch, Kibana, Isinga. You get the picture. And last but not least, the focus of this conference, identity, which for us means Ping Federate, and user onboarding and user self-service, applications, etc. Now, the past few years have taught me one very crucial lesson, which brings me to my second axiom. You should really write this down because this is important. If you are not an identity provider, you should not manage identities. I could spend an hour just talking about how pretending to be an IDP puts your customers and your business at risk. Suffice to say that our goal is to stop being an IDP for any identities, especially customers, but even our own. Why didn't it go down? Hold on, I think I missed one. Oh, that's it. Okay. Secondly, if we're not an IDP, we should never have to authenticate anyone, ever. Meaning we should not be storing any kind of user credentials, such as passwords. These two guiding principles have a huge impact on how we architect identity in our system. So, given our product space, our culture, and those axioms, let's take a look at our simple identity requirements. We have simple needs, so this should look pretty familiar to everyone. We have very, very typical identities. We have some identities that don't come from customers, i.e. Confyrm employees, and they're exactly what you would expect. Engineering, support, product management, marketing, sales, cycle folks, etc. And we have customer identities. Now, customers have two types of identities to support our two engagement models. Sometimes it doesn't go down. Ah, there we go. Now, an infinitesimally, is that the right one? Yes. I apologize for skipping through the slides, but sometimes it doesn't change when I hit down arrow. So a really small number of customer interaction is for managing their accounts. Now, you all understand what that means. Because apparently some customers don't appreciate the power and flexibility of running curl in a shell prompt, we're forced to provide a UI application that does exactly what our published APIs do. So, we have a single-page app running in a browser. There's no back-end server dedicated to supporting the UI. It just accesses our standard APIs. In fact, we could actually publish our apps to a geocached CDN, such as CloudFront or even to S3. But more importantly, the bottom line is the app is an OAuth client. So the login experience results in the app receiving an OAuth access token. Then there's everything else, interaction via service accounts. By the way, that's a screenshot of Postman, if you're not familiar with that. That's like curl on steroids with a really pretty UI. Given our model is a general pub/sub model, you can guess that the archetypical service account is a server that publishes events to our APIs, basically long-running, lights-out app developed by our customers and deployed in their data center. These apps also use OAuth to authenticate to our authorization server and get an access token. Now that results in a fairly typical schema. Again, nothing novel or groundbreaking here, and that's kind of the point. We have customers that own users and clients. Users and clients have credentials for authentication and roles for authorization. It's pretty typical. That simple schema, though, results in a lot of code. 27% of our entire API is dedicated to managing that schema. That's a lot of DevOps cycles. Not to mention the cycles required to manage identity products like Ping Federate. Don't get me wrong, Ping Federate is a world-class product. I love it. I have a long, deep, and intimate relationship with Ping Federate. I just don't want to deploy it in my 100% cloud-based service. But from an identity standpoint, we only need to be able to do two things: trust and validate access tokens, and link a token claim to an account record for attribution. We could save a lot of DevOps cycles if we could push all that identity stuff out of our space altogether. And as a bonus, by not managing identities, we might very well realistically reduce risk to our customers' actual identities. Don't underestimate that. Since we're talking about offloading identities to services, it makes sense to investigate said services, which brings us to identity as a service, or IDaaS. Now, before you all start getting jiggy over IDaaS definitions, I'm not here to define IDaaS for you, and I'm not here to drill down on the available products in the market and how they rate. Gartner has done a really good job at that. Take a look at their Magic Quadrant. But I do need to be able to show how we evaluated our identity requirements against IDaaS offerings. To support that evaluation, we began to define our system from an identity services perspective. Our thinking was that should enable an apples-to-apples comparison between our identity needs and current market offerings. So what do we mean by IDaaS? Gartner defines it like this. It's a cloud-based hosted delivery model that provides, among other things, IGA, access enforcement and analytics, yada, yada, blah, blah. You get the idea. What does that mean to Confyrm? From our perspective, we want an IDaaS to be the glue between a customer's IDP and our service, our API, if you will. Whether the customer is using an IDP service, such as Google, or their own internal enterprise IDP with enterprise products like Ping Federate and CA, we also want an IDP to manage our corporate identities, and we want that IDaaS to be the glue between both our customers' IDPs and our own IDP. I can't tell you where I got this. I will tell you that I stole it. It's a pretty good attempt to begin defining a reference architecture for IDaaS. This is one slide from a deck that provides a reference architecture, or defines a reference architecture. And this is the model that I use to define our system from an identity services perspective. And while all those capabilities are really important, for the sake of brevity, today we're just going to drill down on three of those: managed identity lifecycle, managed privileged access, and managed IAM audit and reporting. So let's look at how we define our system in terms of identity services. Starting with managed identity lifecycle, we're pretty typical here. We could have used a directory, but we decided to use SQL because we already had it deployed. We developed an API for managing user and client resources. And since we manage the users, we need to provide for user self-service, so we have password reset APIs, etc. Authentication is currently provided by Ping Federate. We wrote a custom password credential validator that authenticates users against our Postgres user and credential tables. With respect to managed privileged access, we start by leveraging OAuth from Ping Federate. Every authentication event, every token event, every authorization event, and every access attempt is all audit logged. So we can do rich monitoring and alerting against those log data. With respect to audit reporting, we have a holistic logging infrastructure via the ELK stack. Ping Federate logs are all forwarded into our logging structure. Done. Now, that's our identity infrastructure from an identity services perspective. Now the big question is, what can we push out of our space and leverage from IDaaS? So since we're no longer an IDP, we can push all aspects of identity lifecycle management. That includes both CRUD support as well as user self-service. Not our identities, not our problem. We can push OAuth to client and token management, but we'll keep actual authorization. We could potentially use something like Stormpath for authorization, but since our model is full ABAC, we don't really see that as realistic at this point. However, this is an obvious point of contention. What is the appropriate relationship between our service as an OAuth resource server and an IDaaS as an authorization server? That's still a big question. Role management is another point of contention. Ideally, customers should be able to manage roles for their users, but lack of consistent methods for managing user claims makes that problematic. So we'll keep that for now as well. All right, so there's not enough time to drill down into all the various market offerings, but there are some key takeaways that we learned from our effort. First, managed identity is pretty well supported by IDaaSs today. All offerings we looked at provide a rich assortment of user group claims management. There's great support for user onboarding and self-service. Most offerings have rich APIs, and SCIM is becoming normal as well, or normalized as well. But while basic identity management is well supported, privileged access, well, not so much. Before you start flaming me on what Okta provides or EY or whoever, remember that I'm talking about from a market perspective. Right? And the biggest problem is with respect to OAuth 2 and OIDC support. How it's supported is inconsistent, and in some instances, it's not available at all. A good example of inconsistency is how to manage claims. Some follow SAML norms and let you define what claims to add to the token. Some allow defining scopes. Some support adding claims via fixed scopes. Some require claims to be fetched via another API, such as a graph API. It's just all over the map. The vast majority of IDaaS offerings are targeted towards enterprise customers, and that's key, because enterprises are snowflakes. Every enterprise has a different set of needs, and enterprise products are designed to meet a broad spectrum of needs. Most provide integration to existing enterprise directories and workforce management. A large number also provide really cool employee services, such as controlled access to web internet apps. Those are all great. And yet, according to trend analysis, IAM is rapidly driving towards IDaaS. What does that mean? Well, that means that while IDaaS is expecting enterprises to use a certain set of enterprise on-premises products to integrate with IDaaS, enterprises have the reverse expectation and are actually driving towards those products being provided as services. There's a disconnect there. So I'm hopeful that in the that these shortfalls are going to be addressed in the near future. So I originally envisioned this presentation as a success story, if you will, about how a small SaaS migrated from using IAM applications designed for enterprise on-prem to using IDaaS. But somewhere along the line it morphed. At first it became a rant about how confusing the identity as a service market is. Then it exploded into a tirade about how IDaaS ignores the SaaS market, but that's not really fair. So I'll just simply conclude with a couple call-outs to both SaaSes and IDaaS providers based on our lessons learned. First is this: if you manage identity today and you're not an IDP, cut it out. Develop an exit strategy. If for no other reason than the fact that doing so may actually help make our online identities more secure. If this all sounds familiar, it's because it is. There's no difference between this strategy and the strategy we all use to drive our organizations to centralize IAM. Remember those days? It's the same strategy. The only difference is that centralized IAM is now an external service. Everyone knows that the real money is in enterprise identity services. Newsflash, enterprise will demand IDaaS. The SaaS market should be seen as simply early adopters of what enterprises will soon demand also. That means IDaaS providers actually do need to hear SaaS requirements. So let's make them known. Now, we have very seasoned architectures for enterprise IGA, et cetera, reference architectures. We need the same level of rigor for IDaaS, and we need a standard way to express our user claims. OIDC ID tokens are awesome. Getting claims via an API is awesome. Just don't make us do it different for every IDP and IDaaS. Now, I want to make this very clear. My issues with how IDaaS support OIDC is not about OIDC standards. John Bradley's not here, is he? OIDC is great, but there's a lot of space around those standards, such as how federation fits in, especially with service accounts. That needs to become standardized and adopted so that next year I can come back and talk about how we actually leverage IDaaS to scale our services. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, David. And as an enterprise customer, I'm happy to hear the call to action. We do have a couple minutes for questions. This session is being recorded, so wait for me to get to you with the microphone.
So a common statement I hear from a lot of identity providers is they support SAML, right? It's kind of their trump card. We support SAML. So, and that basically says we're oblivious to any responsibility because we support SAML. And the application providers say they support SAML, and it's kind of their trump card. They say, hey, we support SAML. And somewhere in the middle, there's a user that goes, holy cow, I implemented an identity provider, I've got these applications, and it takes me 3 months to get them up and running, even though both support SAML. Can you give me a little bit of insight in terms of what are the pitfalls between what the identity providers are providing when they say we support SAML, the application providers are saying we do when we support SAML, and why end users have so much difficulty in reality implementing these solutions across these SAML, supposedly SAML compliant services?
That's a really good question, and that's part of what we looked at when we began architecting our system. A lot of that is driven by the simple fact that application providers assume that they own identities for their application, which means that they also need to provide authentication. Now, when you add into that a requirement from enterprises to be able to federate their enterprise identities across the applications they use, now those application providers have a responsibility to manage not only their application identities, but the ability to federate those. And that all stems from the fact that we're proliferating identities across every application. What we did, and is becoming the norm, we didn't invent this by any means, is to flip that and say simply our applications, in our case, our APIs, have no understanding of identities at all. They simply need authorization for a pre-authenticated identity to be used to access its resources. Right? So bottom line is, our APIs are very happy to simply accept an access token as long as they can validate it, use some claim within that access token linked to an application, or I'm sorry, a customer record, if you will, and for attribution, and then subsequently perform authorization. So it doesn't need to federate those identities at all.
So then it sounds like what you're asserting is the issue is in how we manage that identity. And so just because we support SAML at both ends, you still need to have a higher level of integration and communication that happens between the identity provider and the app.
Well, in our case, the integration is between some authorization server and the app. Okay. And the authorization server is responsible for either authenticating the user or service account that's going to make the request, i.e. the OAuth client that's going to make the request, or federating an authentication event, and all of that needs to result in an OAuth token.
But it sounds like when you're making that assertion that says we're asking for an authorization event, that when that identity provider is asking for that authorization is a very specific request. There's a lot of context that needs to be included in that authorization request.
Yeah, and it comes down to how do you federate?
Okay.
And there's loads of different models for federation these days, right? The authorization server, i.e. ping federate, could accept OIDC-based federation. And John Bradley's not here, so I can use that term without having bricks thrown at me. But it's basically the model supported by Google, right? So you can use log in with Google or sign in with Google. Right? That results in OIDC, ID token, potentially a refresh token, and an access token. Right? There's no SAML involved in that.
Okay.
And those tokens are subsequently given to another identity provider or identity service provider, if you will, service provider, and that service provider is then responsible for using that as authentication evidence and subsequently providing an access token.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
That was a long-winded response. I don't know if I answered your question.
It was a very good long-winded response.
No more questions?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for coming today. If you haven't already downloaded the app, please do so. It's available in your app store, and we'd really like your session feedback today. Thank you very much, and enjoy the reception tonight.